Ralph Neas, Disability Rights Leadership Series, 1999-2000. A project of Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, DREDF, with Access Video, University of San Francisco.
The first encounter I had with disability issues came during my first year with Senator Edward W. Brooke of Massachusetts. Senator Brooke, of course, was a hero of mine, a mentor of mine, a friend of mine to this day, and he was probably the person in the Senate on civil rights issues. And he was working with Harrison Williams on Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. So that was my first substantive and political encounter with disability rights. But quite frankly, something happened 6 years later that really ushered in my period of activism with respect to disability rights. And that's when I came down with Guillain-Barre syndrome, also known as French polio, and spent 6 months in the hospital in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and spending about 3 months of that time in the intensive care unit, totally paralyzed, on a respirator, unable to breathe or talk. And over the period of the next year or two, coming to a much better understanding of disability issues and making a vow once I got out of the hospital to do what I could do on a personal and professional basis with respect to disability issues, never knowing that Pat Wright and DREDF would give me so many opportunities so soon after leaving the hospital. But that was really the personal foundation. And then professionally, when I became the executive director of the Leadership Conference in the spring of 1981, shortly thereafter, I met Pat Wright, I met Mary Lou Breslin, I met Arlene Mayerson when they invited me to San Francisco in late 1981 and really introduced me in a very significant, substantive way and political way to disability rights and really helped me and many others, I might add, at that San Francisco conference to begin thinking of disability rights as fundamental civil rights. Fundamental equal opportunity issues, just like issues affecting women and just like issues affecting minorities and others who have been victims of discrimination. And that, of course, led to, I think, one of the most productive decades I've ever seen in terms of the amount of distance covered in such a short a period of time, from having the Civil Rights Coalition acknowledge that disability rights were civil rights to the enactment of the most important, most far-reaching civil rights legislation of the past 3 decades, that being the Americans with Disabilities Act. Sometimes people view an historic event like the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act and don't always understand or know what's led up to it. And there was a decade preceding the Americans with Disabilities Act in which the foundations were laid, which a lot of hard work was done that made the ADA possible. Because when Pat Wright and DREDF came to the scene in the very early 1980s in Washington, D.C., disability rights were not seen so much in a civil rights context, but in a health context. They were not viewed on the same level as women's issues or minority issues or even age issues. And we had to go through an educational phase. We had to educate not just members of Congress, the president, or the press. We had to educate those who had spent their lives working on behalf of equal opportunity issues, working on behalf of civil rights issues. And that was a monumental task. People just weren't accustomed to thinking in this context. And DREDF had a strategy, and DREDF has never, ever gotten the credit it deserves for what happened during the 1980s and during the 1990s. DREDF really was an architect of a 10-year strategy that resulted in the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but not enough people know what went into those first 10 years. How DREDF reached out to the entire civil rights community, helped educate the civil rights community, worked in coalition with the civil rights community, and had a string of successes before the Americans with Disabilities Act. Working with the civil rights community on a voter accessibility bill in 1983, working on the Civil Rights Restoration Act from 1984 to 1988, working on the Fair Housing Act amendments in 1988, working on the Civil Rights Act of 1990 and the Civil Rights Act of 1991. Without question, there was no finer professional moment in my life than when the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law unfortunately, of course, without my presence, as John Sununu decided to disinvite me from the White House signing ceremony. But thanks to Dredif and thanks to Pat Wright, I was asked to play a lead role. Pat Wright was the general, and I guess I was the colonel, and was able to assist in terms of overall strategy, especially with the legislative strategy, and able to help with the execution of that strategy. I'm not sure people realize the comprehensiveness, the sophistication of the strategy that was employed from start to finish, and how many thousands of hours it took, how many thousands of people it took, in the integration of the media, the grassroots, the advocacy, the research, the legal. It was as an extraordinary an effort over a period of 2 years that I've ever seen. In some ways, it was so much in so little time, but it was as coordinated an effort as I've ever witnessed in all the campaigns that I've been part of, and there have probably been 36 major national campaigns that I've been privileged to be a part of, and I don't think anyone fully understands what it takes to get a major law enacted, especially in a generally hostile environment. And this is really praise to everyone who was involved in the effort, both members of the disability community as well as Dredif, as well as the congressional members. There were many challenging moments, but the moments where everything could have been in significant doubt were in the early summer of 1989. We still had a situation where there was a Republican administration, and there were no assurances that that Republican administration would work with the disability community, work with our Republican and Democratic friends in Congress. And I can't remember exactly what day it was, but I think it was mid-June of 1989, Richard Thornburgh testified before the Senate and said he was willing to sit down with the disability community and members of the Senate and work out a compromise on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that led to a 6-week sprint in which Dredif, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, staffers from Senator Harkin's office and Senator Kennedy's office went into marathon negotiations and put together what in large measure did become the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And those 6 weeks were filled with lots of tension. There were lots of conflicts, lots of competitiveness within the Bush administration. Certainly there was not a consensus on the House side or the Senate side. And I'm not sure anyone breathed during those entire 6 weeks. But when it all came together on August 3rd of 1989, it truly was one of the most incredible moments of my life, both professionally and because of my commitment to civil rights. But as you know, Mary Lou, on a personal basis, I was in this very small room in the Capitol. I think it was the Mansfield room, right off the Senate chambers. And in that room was working for Senator Harkin, the person I had just married, Katie Bay niece, one of my very best friends, Bobby Silverstein, another very good friend, and Pat Wright. And we also had Senator Kennedy, my best friend in the Senate, Senator Harkin, and my longtime adversary, Senator Hatch. And of course, Senator Dernberger helped save my life when I had Guillain-Barre syndrome back in 1979 and 1980. So it was this wonderful confluence of circumstances where the most important people in my life were present, working on the most important bill of my life, and all coming together in a 16-0 vote, a unanimous vote on perhaps the most wonderful, radical, revolutionary bill ever to come out of the United States Capitol in almost 2 decades. It was as fine a moment as one could have, with the significant exception of the birth of my daughter about a month ago. And it was one of the best examples I've ever seen of how government should work, how a major law affecting every American should be considered, thoughtfully debated, the appropriate necessary compromises made, and then virtually 90 to 95% of both houses of Congress and the President of the United States signing on to that bill.
Disability Rights Leadership Series, 1999-2000. Producer, Phyllis Ward, Access Video. Interviewers, Phyllis Ward and Mary Lou Breslin. Post-production, editing, captions, audio description, Dave Newell. Stewardship, promotion, distribution. Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. Mary Lou Breslin, Susan Henderson. Special thanks goes to both the sung and the unsung heroes who work tirelessly to make the Americans with Disabilities Act a reality. The Disability Rights Leadership Series owes a debt of gratitude to the individuals who agreed to be interviewed and without whose passion and dedication the ADA would not have become law. The series would not have come about without the vision of Pat Wright, longtime Director of Governmental Affairs for DREDF, and Arlene Mayerson, DREDF's directing attorney, who conceptualized the series and the interview themes. Thanks goes to the University of San Francisco for sponsoring the project that included the Disability Rights Leadership Series, and the Bancroft Library, University of California, Berkeley, for accepting an archival copy of the unedited interviews and providing a safe and permanent home for the collection. The series would not have been possible without funding from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. A list of the interviewees and links to their interviews can be found at dredf.org. 2015.